Before we talk about relational and intersubjective theories, let's recap. We began the semester by talking about biological influences on human development, focusing on genetics and brain development. We then turned to looking at psychodynamic theories, including Freudian psychology, focused on drive theory, conflict theory, structural theory, the typographical model, and the psychosexual stages. Then we looked at ego psychology, which focuses on ego functions such as mastery, adaptation, and the defenses. Object relations theories look at internalization, early childhood development, the holding environment, the good enough caregiver, and the process of separation, individuation. Attachment theory focuses on proximity seeking, the secure base, attachment styles related to early childhood experiences, and qualities of care. Now we look at relational and intersubjective theories. But haven't we been talking about relationships all along? In Freudian psychology, we talked about relationships between the child and parents. In object relations and attachment theory, we also talked about relationships, particularly in early childhood. So what's different here? How do these theories differ from psychodynamic and attachment theories? What's new? Relational theories are said to be two-person theories in which interaction between people is key. But haven't we been talking about this all along? The difference here is that the focus in relational theories is on interactions in psychotherapy. So the two people of interest in relational and intersubjective theories are therapist and client. We're not focusing on parent and child. There's also less emphasis on objective reality, more emphasis on subjectivity, on how the client and therapist feel, on intersubjectivity, areas in which they communicate and come to develop shared understandings, and exploration of meaning and experience between them. Here are some of the main ideas of relational theories. Enactments are the things that occur between us. So intrapsychic and interpersonal issues are played out in relationships through behavioral, nonverbal, and verbal cues. Enactments include all of the ways in which we communicate our thoughts, feelings, wishes, desires, fears. These are important elements of the talking cure. The third space is the sphere that is created between us. So you have one person and her realm, another person and their realm, and the third space between us. This is a sphere of mutual influence, reciprocity, in which meaning is co-constructed, and we have an opportunity to develop intersubjectivity or agreement, shared understanding. Self-disclosure and professional use of the self on the part of the therapist are important issues in this theory. Let's think about power and asymmetry in therapeutic relationships. In the older view, the therapist was an anonymous, enlightened expert. She sat back and listened to the client, searching for meaning and providing insight and analysis. So the therapist was the expert in a position of power, in a hierarchical relationship with the client. She was a blank screen for projection of the client's transference and other issues. This promoted an idealization of the therapist and provides no room for countertransference. The therapist was not allowed to bring in her own unresolved issues into the therapy room, or to consider ways in which the client might trigger her own unresolved, unexamined issues. In relational theories, the therapist is not a blank screen. These theories value a realistic, authentic view of the therapist. The therapist is a whole person who necessarily brings her own issues into the room. And countertransference, the therapist's awareness of the ways in which a client may trigger her own thoughts, feelings, wishes, desires, fears. Countertransference is an essential tool for the therapist's understanding of herself and others. Transference and countertransference are both intrapsychic and interpersonal phenomenon. The projection of our thoughts, feelings, fantasies, and unconscious reactions onto the other, and projective identification, the efforts to make the other experience our thoughts, feelings, fantasies, and so on, provides clues to what the other person is thinking and feeling. These are tools for exploration and for analysis. Intersubjectivity, the development of shared meaning, shared understanding, can be used to question false dichotomies, expert and naive client, can be used to question essentialism and power relations. So in relational theories, the therapist and client are not expert and naive learner. They're both experts. The therapist has one realm of expertise, and the client is the expert on her own experience. This changes the power relations, it changes the power dynamic. Intersubjectivity can also be used to consider the social context in which these two people interact, and their multiple identities inside and outside of the therapy room. Self-disclosure on the part of the therapist was absolutely forbidden in traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy. So much so that if the client asked the therapist questions about her own personal life, the therapist's response was typically something like, "Why do you want to know?" or "Why do you ask that?" And the therapist actively avoided self-disclosure. In this approach, though, careful self-disclosure on the part of the therapist can be used to encourage relatedness and openness about the client's issues. But the goal of disclosure on the part of the therapist is explicitly client-centered. The therapist is not disclosing information herself simply for the purposes of disclosure or for catharsis or for identification. This takes a lot of experience and practice to get this right. An inappropriate disclosure can be harmful to the relationship and to the client's progress in therapy. Disclosures about race, gender, class, and other issues can be useful, particularly in cross-race dyads, where treatment can be complicated by patients' and therapists' fears of saying something racist or offensive. So here the idea is that it's best to talk about these issues explicitly. Race and racism can be seen as psychoanalytic issues as vehicles for defensive or transference-countertransference issues, ways in which displaced aggression, fear, and hatred are enacted. So Leary's article talks about these topics as forbidden talk in psychotherapy, and traditionally they were forbidden. We didn't talk directly about race, gender, and class. In relational and intersubjective theories, these topics are fair game. And Hermuston talks about discourse in the mirrored room being the therapy room, which is thought to reflect the intrapsychic and interpersonal conflicts of the people in that room. And the therapy room also reflects larger social issues in which the people are engaged. So race, class, and gender inevitably come up in the therapy room, according to Hermuston. These hot button issues can be focal points for transference and countertransference. Therefore, they are tools for use in analysis, exploration, and understanding. What are some of the limitations of relational and intersubjective theories? Well, I think there is little empirical evidence for some of the assertions that these theories make. For example, your reading suggests that the relational approach reduces failed treatments and therapeutic impasses and diminishes the risk of boundary violations. Well, I know of no empirical evidence to support that claim. It's focused on relationships in psychotherapy, usually in individual therapy with adult clients, with less emphasis on other relationships, other clients, and other client systems. So that is a limitation of focus. There are considerable strengths here. Carolyn Sari said that there's really little room for individualization or depth in direct practice without psychodynamic and relational concepts. So if we pretend that these relational issues don't exist, we can't really enter into work with clients in any deep, real, or meaningful way. This realistic view of therapist is more useful than an idealistic view of the therapist as expert. It allows the client to be expert on her own experience. It's also focused on the here and now, on what happens between clients and therapists in the room now. Uses in social work include professional use of the self. The social worker makes conscious use of herself. This requires good professional and personal support and good self-care.